The Villisca Axe Murders, a century-old American mystery. On the morning of June 10, 1912, the small town of Villisca, Iowa, woke to a horror that would echo through history. Villisca, a quiet farming community of about 2,000 people, was the kind of place where everyone knew each other, where doors were often left unlocked, and where life revolved around church, school, and the rhythms of rural life. But that morning, the discovery of a gruesome crime shattered the town's sense of safety and left a mystery that remains unsolved over a century later. The tragedy unfolded at the home of Josiah Moore, a 43-year-old businessman who ran a successful implement store in town, selling farm equipment to local farmers. Josiah, known as Joe, lived in a modest two-story house on 2nd Street with his wife, Sarah, 39, and their 4 children, Herman, 11, Mary Catherine, 10, Arthur, 7, and Paul, 5. The Moores were a respected family, active in the Presbyterian Church, and well-liked in the community. On the evening of June 9th, they had attended a children's program at the church, a special event organized by Sarah, who was involved in the church's activities. The program ended around 9:30 p.m., and the Moores walked home with 2 additional guests, Lena Stillinger, 12, and Ina Stillinger, 8, daughters of a neighboring farmer, Joseph Stillinger. The Stillinger girls had been invited to spend the night at the Moore house, a treat after the church event. The Moore family and their guests likely went to bed around p.m., settling into the small house for what should have been a peaceful night. The house had 2 bedrooms upstairs, one for Joe and Sarah, another for the children, and a guest room on the main floor where Lena and Ina slept. There were no signs of trouble that night, no reports of strange noises or suspicious figures in the neighborhood. Villisca was a place where such things seemed unthinkable, but sometime between midnight and a.m., an intruder entered the house. What happened next was a massacre. At around a.m. on June 10th, a neighbor, Mary Peckham, grew concerned when she noticed the Moore house was unusually quiet. The family typically started their day early. Joe would be at his store, the children playing outside, but the curtains were drawn, and there was no sign of life. Mary knocked on the door, but no one answered. She called Joe's brother, Ross Moore, who lived nearby. Ross arrived with a spare key and entered the house around a.m. What he found was beyond comprehension. In the downstairs guest room, Ross discovered the bodies of Lena and Ina Stillinger. Both girls had been struck repeatedly with an axe, their heads crushed, their faces unrecognizable. Blood soaked the bed and splattered the walls. Shocked, Ross called for the town marshal, Henry Hank Horton, who arrived quickly and proceeded upstairs. There, the scene was even worse. In the master bedroom, Joe and Sarah Moore lay dead in their bed, their heads bludgeoned with the same ferocity. In the children's room, Herman, Mary Catherine, Arthur, and Paul were found in their beds, all killed in the same manner. The axe had been wielded with such force that the ceilings above each bed were marked with blood, and fragments of bone and brain matter were scattered across the rooms. Marshal Horton and other townspeople who arrived at the scene noted several disturbing details. The murder weapon, an axe belonging to Joe Moore, was found in the downstairs guest room, partially wiped clean but still bearing traces of blood. A 4-pound piece of bacon was placed next to the axe, an odd detail that baffled investigators. Some later reports suggested it might have been a slab of soap, but the bacon detail persisted in early accounts. Every mirror in the house had been covered with cloth or clothing, as if the killer wanted to avoid seeing their own reflection. The doors were locked from the inside, and a lamp with its chimney removed was found at the foot of Joe and Sarah's bed, suggesting the killer had moved through the house with light. A basin of bloody water in the kitchen indicated the murderer had washed their hands before leaving. The crime scene quickly became chaotic. Before the marshal could secure the house, dozens of curious neighbors and townspeople entered, walking through the rooms, touching objects, and contaminating potential evidence. By the time a proper investigation began, the scene was hopelessly compromised. Dr. J. Clark Cooper, the county coroner, arrived to examine the bodies and estimated the time of death between midnight and a.m. based on the state of rigor mortis. The autopsies confirmed that all 8 victims had been killed with the axe, with Joe Moore suffering the most blows. His face was so badly damaged that one of his eyes was nearly dislodged. Lena Stillinger, one of the guest girls, showed signs of defensive wounds on her arm, suggesting she may have woken during the attack and tried to fight back. There was no evidence of sexual assault, though Lena's nightgown was pulled up, which some investigators noted as unusual. The investigation was led by Marshal Horton, but he was soon joined by state investigators and private detectives hired by the Moore family. The brutality of the crime and the murder of children shocked the nation, and newspapers across the country covered the story extensively. The Des Moines Register ran headlines like "Family of 6 and 2 Guests Slain in Beds," and reporters flocked to Villisca interviewing residents and speculating about the killer's identity. The lack of a clear motive, no money was stolen, and there were no known enemies of the Moores, made the case even more perplexing. Several suspects emerged in the days and weeks following the murders. The first was Frank F. Jones, a prominent Villisca businessman and state senator who had a professional rivalry with Joe Moore. Joe had worked for Jones for 9 years before leaving to start his own implement business, taking many of Jones's clients with him. Some townspeople believed Jones held a grudge, and rumors circulated that he had hired someone to kill the Moores. However, there was no direct evidence linking Jones to the crime, and he was never charged. Another suspect was Reverend George Kelly, a traveling Presbyterian minister who had been in Villisca the night of the murders, attending the same church event as the Moores. Kelly was known for his erratic behavior and had a history of mental instability. Witnesses reported seeing him leave town on an early train the morning after the murders, and some claimed he had acted strangely during his time in Villisca, showing an unusual interest in the crime after it occurred. In 1914, Kelly wrote letters to investigators claiming to have visions of the murders, describing details that weren't publicly known, such as the position of the bodies. He was arrested in 1917 and stood trial twice for the murders, but both trials ended in hung juries, and he was released. Kelly later recanted his confessions, claiming they were coerced, and no definitive evidence tied him to the crime. A third suspect was Henry Lee Moore, no relation to the victims, a drifter and suspected serial killer who was later convicted of similar axe murders in other states, including the 1911 murders of a family in Colorado Springs, Colorado. Henry Moore's crimes bore similarities to the Villisca killings: the use of an axe, targeting entire families, and covering mirrors, but he was never directly linked to the Villisca case, and investigators couldn't place him in Iowa at the time of the murders. Other theories pointed to a transient killer, possibly a railroad worker, as Villisca was a stop on the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad, and the town saw many travelers passing through. Some investigators believe the murders were part of a series of axe killings across the Midwest in the early 1900s, including murders in Colorado, Kansas, and Illinois, all of which involved entire families killed in their homes with an axe. However, no definitive connection was ever proven, and the transient theory remains speculative. The investigation was hampered by the lack of forensic technology in 1912. Fingerprinting was in its infancy and not widely used in rural Iowa, and blood evidence couldn't be analyzed beyond basic typing, which wasn't helpful in this case. The contamination of the crime scene by townspeople made it nearly impossible to collect reliable evidence, and the lack of witnesses left investigators with little to go on. Rewards totaling $5,000, a significant sum at the time, were offered for information leading to the killer's arrest, but no credible tips emerged. The Villisca Axe murders had a profound impact on the town and the nation. In Villisca, fear gripped the community. Residents began locking their doors, a practice that had been uncommon before the murders, and some families slept with weapons by their beds. The Moore house became a grim landmark, and the funeral for the 8 victims, held on June 12, 1912, drew thousands of mourners from across Iowa. The caskets were displayed in the town square, and the Presbyterian church, where the Moores had spent their last evening, was filled to capacity during the service. The bodies were buried in the Villisca cemetery, with a single monument marking the graves of the Moore family and the Stillinger girls. Nationally, the murders became a symbol of the vulnerability of rural America, a reminder that even the most idyllic towns weren't immune to violence. The case also highlighted the limitations of early 20th century law enforcement, particularly in small towns with limited resources. The investigation dragged on for years, with occasional new leads such as Kelly's arrest in 1917, but by the 1920s, it had gone cold. The Moore house was eventually sold and repurposed, but its history never faded. In the 1990s, the house was restored to its 1912 appearance and opened as a tourist attraction, the Villisca Axe Murder House, where visitors can tour the rooms where the murders occurred. Some claim the house is haunted, reporting strange noises, moving objects, and ghostly apparitions. Though these accounts remain anecdotal, over the decades, the Villisca Axe murders have been revisited by historians, journalists, and true crime enthusiasts. In 1994, a documentary titled Villisca, Living with a Mystery explored the case, interviewing surviving relatives and townspeople. Books like Morning Ran Red by Stephen Bowman have fictionalized the events, but the true story remains elusive. Modern forensic techniques, such as DNA analysis, could potentially shed new light on the case, but no physical evidence from 1912 has been preserved in a condition suitable for testing. The Iowa Attorney General's Cold Case Unit still lists the Villisca murders as an open case, but with no living suspects or new leads, the chances of solving it are slim. The Villisca Axe murders remain one of America's most haunting unsolved mysteries, a tragedy that claimed 8 lives and left a small town forever changed. The questions linger. Who could commit such a brutal act, and why? Was it a personal vendetta, a random act of violence, or the work of a serial killer passing through? For the families of the Moores and the Stillingers, and for the town of Villisca, the lack of answers is a wound that has never fully healed. The full story of this chilling case is on my channel, where I dive deeper into the historical context, the investigation, and the lasting impact on Villisca. Subscribe now to explore every detail of this century-old mystery, and leave a comment. Who do you think was behind the Villisca Axe murders? Frank Jones, Reverend Kelly, or someone else entirely? Join the conversation and help keep this story alive.